I'm Richard Ryan.
And I'm Garrett Chaffin-Quiray.
This is episode 12 of the High-Low Bro Show, A Man Escaped in the Big Doll House. A group of women detest their captivity and figure out a way to escape, but it does not work out. They're either killed in the process or ultimately they're just redelivered to the prison despite all of the bloodshed that they are able to visit upon their one-time captors. What has made its reputation is that it's tied to women in prison as a subgenre of exploitation, whereby we meet a lot of early 20s women who are not wearing very much and who spend whole pieces of the movie trying to seduce one another or the men around them, or being seduced by or harassed or assaulted by the men and women around them, and often then resulting in their nude bodies being displayed for our very happy-making eyes. And my connection to it, the reason why I selected this as one half of our pairing, is I've got a long-form relationship, parasocially of course, with Pam Grier. This is one of her earliest performances, and she plays a character named Grier, although at this stage in her career, she's largely there as a clothes horse, or in certain scenes, to be a non-clothes horse.
I think the real star of the movie is Roberta Collins, and I'm not the only person out there who thinks that. One of the people it turns out it's influenced, his name is Stace England, and he grew up in southern Illinois, but he also has a very obvious love for 70s exploitation films. And so he, with his band, operating under the name of the Screen Syndicate, have released an album called Roberta Stars in the Big Doll House. All of the actresses, and I call them that without reservation. I mean, I think they're giving real performances in a very specific kind of tone and context. Pam Grier has not yet emerged as the B-level film diva that she will eventually become, or as the very fine actress she emerges out in, I think, Quentin Tarantino's critically appreciated but kind of underwatched Jackie Brown.
Here, those skills, they're still emerging. The ability to carry her character beyond being just a physical presence of some remarkable beauty. This features a group of sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic women, a kind of a microcosm of female beauty and of criminality, because of course they're all in prison for various reasons, whether it's drug addiction, political activity, just straightforward street crime, what have you, and they're put into this sort of festering pool in this terrible prison where we think of them along these stereotypic ways. However, they're also able to form friendships, collaborate with one another, and achieve a group goal, that is escape, or at least the attempt to escape, on the basis of the fact they are very different kinds of people.
And I think this is also, interestingly enough, true of our Bresson movie. I have decided this might be a dynamic of prison movies, is that because they take place in such small, confined spaces, right? They're not big action thrillers where you've got long chases down highways, and a lot of it just takes place in a cell. It's got a theatrical quality in the sense that confinement is kind of like a stage in a relatively small theater. Confinement actually enlarges the human character. So you could say, well, Alcott and Grier and Bodine, and they're all just almost stupidly gorgeous women who aren't at the time that this film was made particularly well known, even outside the very narrow B circuit or C level cinema that they're working in. They all do more than competent jobs, and they all create very distinct character types. And I think that's partly a function of the pretty precise direction by Jack Hill, who I think we should give a lot of credit to. And I think that Hill is able to get such precise performances because the space that he places them in brings their characters out.
These women are in a group cell with bunk beds. They have different hairstyles. They have different ways of adjusting their uniforms so they're distinct. And the camera does favor them in mid-shot and periodically in close-up. So we learn that one is a drug addict, and we watch her with her works and how she twitches and deals with her addiction. We watch one who's kind of a rebel. There's the blonde. There's the black woman. And each one is defined in that sort of very broad way. But we do, as you say, get to see them in their confinement being defined by their behaviors and also marked inside of the cell where they belong. One is a top bunk on this side of the room. This is a bottom bunk on the other side of the room. And that little bit of geography, this would play well if we were to open this off Broadway today and do it as straight theater on a proscenium, because this stage could be arranged so the audience always have the privilege of perfect position. And still, because they had access to this unused penitentiary that had gone into disrepair, they can, in periodic scenes, go outside onto the grounds of this prison and watch the women do their required duties, go to mealtime, be harassed by some of the men who deliver goods to and from the prison, be harassed by the warden and her minions, and so on. That's all, I think, sort of skillfully done, and the movie's pretty short, so it doesn't belabor things that are not of interest to us, and it very quickly puts us in mind that we're going to be watching sex and sexuality being used to titillate the audience, but also to help these women engineer their attempted escape, and there will be bloodshed. All of that is delivered, and that's the point of this kind of a movie.
Get it on! Yeah!
One of the things that I think is interesting about the movie are four central actresses, Rear, Alcott, Bodine, and Collier, how they come to their decision to escape. What happens to them in the course of the first hour are, in some cases, funny, in some cases, bizarre, and in some cases, really horrible experiences. One of the most incredible moments is when the Collier character, there are at least 3 torture scenes, scenes of a half-clothed or in some cases fully naked female being strapped to a table and tortured while a mysterious hooded masked figure looks on. At the very end of the film, discover that the masked hooded voyeur is none other than the commandant, who seems very kind of genteel and civilized, but who turns out to be a kind of neo-Nazi who wants purity and who thinks her prisoners are filth that deserve to be tortured and if necessary, exterminated. She, in fact, the commandant, watches these torture scenes with what's obviously a sort of sexual relish. And in this particular scene, Judy Brown is tied naked to a steel bench, and a cobra is lowered from a bondage device over her body. It's a scary, creepy scene. And of course, the actress, Judy Brown, the character Collier, is terrified. And I think it prefigures that uber classic trash cinema moment, the scene in Re-Animator where a naked Barbara Crampton strapped to a table is about to have cunnilingus performed on her by a decapitated zombie head.
Let me go!
That's it, my dearest Meg. More passion.
One thing that occurs to me as you're talking about this scene, the scene with the snake, it is at once really disturbing and really ridiculous and obviously exploitative of this actress's willingness to be nude, and it just amps up all of these strange feelings and expectations. So one little backup flash for why Garrett's fascinated by this movie and others like it has to do with the fact when I was first exposed to this style of entertainment, long before we had the web where you could get a streaming service of any form of violence or paraphilia that a person could imagine. This is back in the 80s. At that same age, not only am I feeling the sap rise in a young Garrett entering adolescence, I'm also just aware enough of how movies and entertainment generally are made to realize that people are volunteering their services to be cast and crew members and make believe. And so you're watching something that is unbelievable, although it also excites something you hope could happen because you have an appetite for unusual paraphilias and violence and so on. So
tell some of our audience members exactly what paraphilia is. I know what it means, but I think you might want to...
sexual appetites that are to one side of procreative activities. This would include even things like oral sex. This would include different forms of petting, different forms of worship and body fetishism and so on. But it's stuff that will never lead to kids.
Right.
And of course, many of us practice and enjoy these kinds of appetites and goals. And this movie explores them in a sort of excessive and vulgar and gross way. And it does so on purpose, with these actresses and some actors in certain scenes doing so willingly. And so when I bumped into this entertainment as a youth, I was recognizing these people can't possibly believe that this is supposed to be, quote, serious, unquote. On the other hand, it's rendered with such sobriety that despite it being despicable, gross, vulgar, you name your adjective, it does impact a person both in the groin, where it's aiming, but also in the brain, where you know you're being worked on and bothered. These images will stick with a person because they're not meant to be realistic depictions of what it is to flay a person. There are scenes when people face blades and are cut. The blood is not the actual color of human blood when it leaves the body. It's sprayed more like paint. It is expressionistic. Yet the actions that lead to that kind of graphic display do get under your skin. So to that degree, these filmmakers, led by Jack Hill, our director, do their job of making something that is exploitative. Yes, we do see the things we're not supposed to see and not supposed to talk about with polite members of polite society, but it does so to be purposefully difficult. That, to me, has always been the success of this form, especially of the 1970s, when exploitation movies were this black box operation you would go to only in urban centers, really, in a bad part of town. And then when I was a kid in the 80s, you would struggle to put together your dimes to go get the rental from that section of the store that you're not supposed to go when you were my age, but you desperately wanted to. And every now and then, you would have a chance to see an entertainment like this one. But then you would also have redistributive justice meted out by these women who are harmed. They eventually get weapons and they mangle a lot of people in making their escape. All of that bubbles to mind in this description you gave of that Cobra torture scene because it's even more laughably unrealistic somehow.
It's phantasmagorical. The film is an enormous sustained bondage fantasy movie.
That's right.
It's got sadomasochistic elements. It's got girl-on-girl sex. It's got several scenes that specifically involve rape or the threat of rape, all of which are, if treated in a humorous or trivializing manner, are probably deservedly regarded as taboo and verboten. Nevertheless, this film is very compelling, and because it's so clearly a sustained dream sequence, their makeup is always preserved, right? After they're beaten and tortured, they show up a day later looking again like they're ready for a swimsuit photo shoot. And I've been thinking a lot about this, about exploitation cinema, and I'm speaking now as the high representative on our high-low spectrum. When you think about exploitation cinema as a kind of working class or lower class genre of entertainment,
it's aimed directly at men mostly. There are access points for certain kinds of women, particularly those who are not straight, who are probably not white ladies, and who probably also want to see women who are echoing some of the real-world experiences of feeling under the thumb of brutal men, who nonetheless are able to get one over on those fellows by becoming violent themselves. It is a working out of pent-up fantasy through very blunt means.
If you start thinking about exploitation cinema in those terms, suddenly you can absorb films like this as manifestations of what I'm going to call the demotic id, meaning the collective unconscious of those Americans or other people in other parts of the world who watched these films back in the 70s, there are vast reserves. There were back then, and there remain to this day. Vast reservoirs of resentment, regrets, taboo desires, unfulfilled hopes that lurk under the various forms of repression and suppression that society puts on all of us, right? And you want and hope to see those repressed desires and urges, the paraphilia, as you call it, you hope to see it on the screen. In fact, you're ecstatic when you see it on the screen.
Right.
But also the desire for real freedom, not just physical freedom, which of course in some ways literally both of our films are about, but the desire for emotional and psychic freedom. On a day-to-day basis, a working class marginalized person, they may well have lurking just beneath the surface, they have residual emotional responses which they can't express and they're forbidden to express. And so they have to repress them. But we've all read our forehead. What happens to the repressed? It always returns, right? They come back to you in your dreams. They come back to you in kind of waking fantasies. And pretty soon you have to find some way to see them expressed, or you're going to start acting them out in very neurotic, if not even psychotic ways, right?
You'll be mentally anguished. You'll be emotionally stunted. You might do criminally inappropriate things. But when you're able to see it expressed in this format, in a movie like The Big Dollhouse, you not only realize that there are others who similarly have some of these desires, fantasies, and troubles, but they have figured out a way to present it out there that you can consume and unpack some of that, unwind some of that terrible mental energy that's troublesome. It's work. And you get to enjoy it as a form of entertainment. You also get to feel less isolated because there is a huge audience for this kind of material.
I'm going to bet that every single person has discovered that they had a fantasy, a desire, an urge that they were ashamed of. And then when you discover that other people share them, it's so cathartic and so liberating, right? Almost every major filmmaker of the mid and late 70s, they were heavily influenced by Roger Corman. His film output gave the great 70s...
De Palma, Demi, they all come from this kind of a background,
Demi.
Right?
Yeah, they all grew up watching these films and saying, oh, if Roger Corman, Jack Hill, the people working under Roger Corman, which included Scorsese, by the way, and
Yeah.
Coppola as well, I believe. If Roger can get these things on film, then imagine what I can do in my theoretically more serious or more literary movies. If I had gone and seen The Big Dollhouse in 1971, I think I would have regarded it as revelatory.
It presents a set of desires and appetites and expressions that I didn't know were allowed, and it explores them at some length for all kinds of different sort of entertainment and pleasure values that I'm unused to. The same season that this comes out, by the way, is the same season in which Sweetback's Baadasssss song comes out. It's the same season as Billy Jack, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Carnal Knowledge, Shaft. All of that is out, but so is The Omega Man, which we've talked about before. And in some ways, each of those movies is exploring some of the similar thematic ideals that this one is also exploring. What is the value of an individual in a dehumanizing institution that's only purpose is to break somebody down into absolutely nothing? How do you survive that? Now, there are ways to express that are positive, virtuous, and uphold social values that are mainstream, but a lot of that is not agreeable to people who can't fit into the mainstream. And so you're right, this would have been extraordinary to see in 1971. My God, they actually made this. They actually made it with all of these performers, with all of these sets, with all of this violence and sensuality, with this conclusion. My goodness, what else is possible on that example?
I think that 1971 is in many ways a crux point when American counterculture, and specifically the anti-Vietnam War movement, has begun to get a little sour. What had seemed like a very hopeful and kind of transformative moment in American history and culture, it starts to become ugly and it starts to splinter. I think this is one of the things that The Big Dollhouse reflects very accurately. It's this moment in American culture where people are extremely unhappy. They're even kind of horrified, but they're not sure what to do about it. And so they have different reactions.
We're just before the moment when the whole of the mainstream Hollywood-defined system becomes renovated towards a different sort of creative and commercial goal. I know that we tend to date that to something like 75, when Jaws marks the seasonal summer release schedule of the so-called blockbuster. But we can backdate that a bit to something like 72, when The Godfather takes very pulpy entertainment forms that would have been considered sort of low and exploitative, the gangster movie, but ramps it up with a variety of really skillful artistic manipulations to turn it into hugely commercial, but also incredibly aesthetically significant artwork as well. Now, you can always make your argument about any given year's very greatest movies or very worst movies. It does seem that 71 leading into 72 does feature a bunch of movies with a lot of experiments all over the map that do fantastically well with finding an audience. This one, there were domestic reports of its overall box office of something like $10 million of gross against a budget of something like $125,000.
And that's why Roger Corman got to keep on making films, is because he was reaching an audience, he was touching a nerve, he was producing films that people wanted to see, and they just let him go.
There's been a movement in the last 15 or 20 years that's sometimes called mumblecore, which was associated with brand new digital camcorders that were inexpensive to purchase or lease or even borrow or sometimes buy and then return to an electronics company. And then people were able to make feature-length movies using video cards, often quite good movies, but to do something with almost no invested capital. There is a core cost of getting your technology together. Back in the 70s, it was your camera and your film stock. And then there's a cost of hiring your performers. Well, you don't go top shelf. You find emerging people who don't have a brand name yet. You find a location with props that are easy, free, and not difficult to move around or use, or are even donated and expertly programmed by people who own them, who just simply want to be in a movie. That costs nothing but the good luck and the seeking of that kind of fortunate circumstance, which is one reason why this was shot in the Philippines. When you go to the Philippines in the 1970s, you're moving away from union regulation. So you can run your cast and crew as long as they can stand up and keep their eyes open.
What's the greatest film of the 70s that was shot in the Philippines, although it's allegedly set in Vietnam?
Well, that's Apocalypse Now.
Of course. And what's striking when you watch The Big Dollhouse and its very, very interesting successor, The Big Birdcage, right?
It's almost like a location shoot as feature film for subsequent filmmakers who would say, you know, those jungle scenes really look great. Those earth tones in the soil looks wonderful. Look at that sunlight, so bright. And everybody looks a little bit sweaty, but in a way that actually makes a healthy person look lovelier. And on top of that, human labor is inexpensive. You can hire just incredible numbers of people as extras, or in the case of Coppola, as armies, armies of people to fill up a scene. And that is easier to do than if you're going to be in one of the skirting communities of suburban Los Angeles, where there's not space, you don't have this particular flora and fauna, and you certainly don't have the low costs of labor and of equipment and all of the rest. What you also then have is just physical distance from a lot of financiers. And this is the 70s, where it was expensive to make phone calls and check in with a corporate office. And you can easily, because of time zone shifting and all of the rest, just let people who are the bean counters, let them go.
Though it's shot in what we can call, without any kind of pejorative connotation, the developing world, there's really basically no Filipino presence in this. That's true of Apocalypse Now as well. There's the scene
it's
where
possible then to read the movie as a kind of an allegory of its production, that it is able to evacuate a culturally rich landscape and personscape to become a generic place. The prison, where the women, American, are held captive. This brings to mind a recent hit, Top Gun Maverick, which is also about an enemy that Tom Cruise has to go fight over there that is always ill-defined on purpose, so you're able to place upon that whatever your worries might be. So perhaps then in the 1970s, the Philippines, for a variety of business reasons, becomes that space we can occupy by parking all of our Western, our American, our Hollywood-based assumptions, and our audience will go for it because they're never ever going to be cross-checked to realize, oh no, those folks are reading Tagalog. I can tell because that's what the newspaper says. Oh wait, these are Ilocano speakers. I can tell because of what it sounds like. No, all of that's evacuated for a sort of a general impression of a tropical bad place.
What I'm finding with The Big Dollhouse, I've now watched it 3 times in the last month or so. Every time I watch it, I learn something new. It's that kind of thematic density that I think separates, let's call it important cinema, from cinema that just kind of throw away and you say, this is just the same generic story I've seen again and again. Now, I want to quickly say something about the performances because I think that's important. And I think that's one of the things that sustains this film. There's a character named Herod who's a heroin junkie. You quickly realize that Herod, to put it in street terms, is Greer's bitch. Greer is openly and self-confessedly lesbian, yet another very subversive and transgressive element of this film, and who not only explicitly prefers women to men, she takes one of her fellow prisoners who's a junkie and uses her heroin habit to turn her into what's essentially a sex slave. And there's a moment toward the end of the movie, just before the escape attempt, where Herod says to Greer, as she's sitting there going through heroin withdrawal and pleading for Greer to get her more smack.
Oh, I'm only good for lighting your cigarettes and kissing your ass.
Greer just looks at her kind of contemptuously and turns away, and Herod comes up behind her.
I'm not pretty enough anymore, am I?
She stabs Greer in the neck, and Greer bleeds to death. It's an amazing moment.
One of the things about these lower-budgeted exploitation movies made for a very specific audience with very specific aims and particular subject matter that's sort of required to fit that bill, as we've discussed. One thing about that is an uneven quality to performance and also to crewing positions, lighting that can change, props that don't always work, the choreography and use of firearms. In this movie seems kind of strange. It's like they've never met a rifle before and don't really know what they're doing, and so on. The fact is, there are little gem moments, and you've identified a couple with these key performers that you remember well. When we consider something that's on the high side, but explores similar material, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that the polish of performance, of crew membership and production, is simply higher and more even. There aren't giant gaps the way that there can be in this. For example, whenever the guards had their few lines in this to herd the women to their cafeteria to eat or to herd them back to their cells, they're plainly not performers of any skill. They weren't given much instruction, and the direction is very shoddy. But when we switch over to something like A Man Escaped, those very small secondary roles that have just a little bit of screen time carry with them the appropriate measure of menace or warmth that the part requires, even though they might only be a few seconds long. I think that has to do with a higher level of expectation and also moving aside some of these exploitative elements, because really, if a bunch of 13-year-olds watching this stuff on video, as I once was, are just waiting for people to disrobe, they'll suffer a lot of bad dialogue and a lot of stupid things to get to the stuff they're really there for. On the other hand, if a person is cued into a movie because from first to last they want quality, the stakes are different. And I think that's one of the key things about A Man Escaped that is, with me, as I turn and think about that movie, the whole of it is so very well executed that when it's over with, I don't have the singular sense of, well, that was a really great scene that helped me get through the 15 minutes of not very good work. The whole of it is very good. So now, Richard, let me turn and ask you to clarify why you are drawn to A Man Escaped, but first also expressing that I am really gappy in the great works of cinematic art that I have not ever seen. So I don't know much about the filmmaker Robert Bresson. And when you suggested that we watch this movie, A Man Escaped, with my movie, The Big Dollhouse, I thought, well, that's a great opportunity for me to be less ignorant. But I'm also curious what this movie does for you. When in brief, it's a Frenchman is put into a jail in the middle of World War II, and he decides he's going to get out of jail. He's going to escape, and he does. That's the whole movie. And inside of that, we nonetheless realize it's often considered one of the great works of cinematic art. So tell me, what is the frame of reference for Richard Ryan to respond to this movie and promote it in the way that we now are as part of our podcast?
The Big Dollhouse is a hot mess.
It's a high wall and a hard run.
A Man Escaped it's almost like a beautiful filigreed gym work. There's no moment in the film that doesn't count for something. It's based on a true story. Andre Devigny was indeed locked up in Montluc prison during the war for suspected participation in the French resistance, which in fact he was a member of. As soon as he got in, he was trying to escape when he was caught and thrown into prison. You see this in the very first scenes of the film. The moment he gets into prison, starts plotting his escape. And at the end, he succeeds. It's told in incredibly concise and particular frames and scenes. There's not a lot of what you would call real action, although the film does have a real tension and drama to it. But it's all created by your growing psychic anticipation about whether or not the character Fontaine, our protagonist, will manage to escape. I think what makes this film something that filmmakers like Bergman and Godard, and you can mention just about any great European filmmaker, but also a lot of very great American filmmakers have mentioned as a masterpiece, is that incredibly slow building pressure towards what we hope is a triumphant conclusion.
You say slow build, and that's true. But it has really fast cuts. There are a lot of individual shots in this movie. It is not some big sustained cinema with 8-minute-long takes, and you've only got so many of them in the runtime of about 100 minutes. There's a lot of close-ups, a lot of mid-shots, a lot of exploration of this very confined space, and this restrictive, very meticulous work that he performs to figure out how to literally burrow his way through his door, to find a way to get together a grappling hook, to create rope, etc., etc. And there is the use of fades to move us from one time period to another, and therefore give us an impression of the passage of time and the pressure that mounts, because we realize, as he realizes, some of the other inmates are being executed for their crimes against the then controlling state of France, which were the Germans.
You automatically get a deadline / time frame, either positive or negative, that you're anticipating. I think that heavy use of montage, it's kind of cut.
And I am used to thinking of movies from this period. This is 1956 when it's released, 57 when it makes it to the United States. This is a period, it was about the same time some other world historic European movies were also rolling through American theaters, like The Seventh Seal, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Paths of Glory, Nights in Cabiria. When movies are, well, I guess I want to use the word stable. They take a certain breadth of time. In the ensuing decades, we've learned to digest visual material a lot faster than audiences could manage in the 1950s. But as this movie unwound in front of me, a contemporary viewer, I didn't feel like I had too much wandering attention. I kept in line with this narrow story, partly because I was moved along to different points of view rather quickly and beyond my expectation of similar aged movies, which are more stable, more sort of static seeming, that are slower going. And a lot of the violence that you referred to, that sense of dread of what could happen if he does not escape, generally happens off screen, or we hear it reported, or we hear the sounds that suggest things to us which allow us to imagine it. But I do want to point out one exceptional bit of violence that sort of surprised me. It got me back on heels, so I really paid attention. Beginning of the movie, when he's first captured.
He jumps out of the car. The car is slowing down, and he rolls out into the street and then is immediately recaptured.
And he's beaten kind of violently by the guards when the intake happens and he goes into prison. Why that is significant is, again, for its time, I'm used to seeing gunplay in westerns in the 1950s and earlier, but that's not photorealistic, where you see then the gore or the bloodshed. This being a black and white movie, I'm sure it's chocolate syrup or something on his face, but he's injured and he bleeds on himself and he never changes clothes.
Because famously, as people who have been in prison report, time changes and it either slows to an agonizing crawl, or it speeds up, or just starts to blur. You can't really tell exactly how long he's in Montaluc, or how many days or weeks or months have gone by. I think we're really talking about a relatively short amount of time, but because the film is so methodical, you're involved in our lead character's entire psychology, which is simply about, how do I escape?
And he makes all kinds of little decisions, how he pries through his wooden door. For me, I have a fundamental memory of being a youth, being taken to go see Escape from Alcatraz in a double feature at my local drive-in. The other half was S.O.B., if these movies mean anything to you. But what I do recall is seeing the entirety of Escape from Alcatraz. And what I remember about that, which compares very directly to A Man Escapes, so no doubt Don Siegel and Eastwood were aware of it and probably watched it for pointers, is the way in which the Alcatraz character is figuring out a way to get out of Alcatraz by pulling apart his cell, by grinding through the concrete, and then hiding that material so the guards won't notice until finally they realize he's simply disappeared and gone. He's made good on his escape. Because that's early in my life's experience of going to the movies, and I couldn't put that in the order chronologically of when things actually happened, I realized that in 1956, not only is Robert Bresson exploring a very tenacious man with a very specific goal and a target for all of his behaviors are yoked to this one problem that he's got to solve, but it's also a how-to manual. How do you actually get out of confinement? Well, first, look at your box springs, look at your mattress, look at your clothes. What are you fed? What can you hide? What are your tools? What material around you can benefit your current problem and solve the dilemma that you face, which in his case is death by firing squad in time of war. I've got to escape, I've got to escape. And it's very good about turning all of those everyday qualities of, I'm asleep on a mattress. Can this mattress be something else? I don't know. Let's investigate. It made me think, when I pushed away from this movie and it was done, all of the different ways I could transform not just paper clips, which we've seen in movies before, but a pencil or an eraser or shreds of carpet or even threads from my garments coming loose, whether it's my socks or my shirt. These could all be turned into tools.
Let me simply interject here. I think all of your comments about this are very apropos, but I think the film that in some ways most captures that very pragmatic, desperate desire to turn ordinary or maybe unexpected objects into devices for your freedom. I think the film that most captures that is Robert Zemeckis' very fine Castaway.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to imagine that Zemeckis and Hanks had to have, at some point, watched A Man Escaped and thought it's kind of the same story. It's about individuals who are caught in situations where they seem to have no resources, and you find out how to make a soccer ball your best friend. Part of what I think is profound about people in prison movies is that it captures that innate human desire to be free. Mm-hmm. But that certain people, confronted with a choice between imprisonment, captivity, and a desperate grasp for freedom, which may very well end in their deaths, they'll choose the attempt for freedom. The great American Civil War movie, Glory, captures this very well, where you've got a group of black soldiers, the Massachusetts Regiment, fighting under I think it's Colonel Robert Shaw, who end up all being basically all of the heroes at the end of Glory end up dying, very much like the heroines at the end of The Big Dollhouse. But that's not important. The important thing that you feel at the end of the movie is that they tried to get free.
And there's a really intense sort of moral quandary in the middle of that, because I've acquired enough age and experience with my own decision making to realize that the impulse to give up when something is hard is strong. So it requires a certain kind of grit for somebody to not knuckle under to circumstances that are so overwhelming and to fight them. What makes A Man Escaped, I think, remarkable in the face of comparing it with The Big Dollhouse, but the comparison you've just made to Glory, and before that to Castaway. The leads in those movies, those leads are wronged people. They don't deserve, in any respect, the confinement and the punishment that they are enduring, but they're choosing to find some way out of it. Another little bubble. It's similar to Castaway. There's the Robert Redford movie All Is Lost, about a man who is sort of quasi shipwrecked inside of his sailboat that's injured at sea and must then make choices.
A first-rate film that no doubt flows down from A Man Escaped in the same way that Castaway does.
That's right.
Yeah.
What's the next best decision I can make to prolong my humanity, to prolong my endurance, to prolong my life, and potentially save my life? And in these examples, there's often a good outcome. In Castaway, he fulfills his duty as a FedEx agent. In All Is Lost, there is this glimmer of potential survival. Glory ends differently, but the overall point of their efforts to become soldiers in this regiment against the racial apartheid of their time was to create a legacy that has outlasted them, and it has. So there's some really deep waters that this movie A Man Escaped, this sort of quasi-procedural vehicle to watch an ingenious man do a very small set of tasks but do it very well. It speaks to a very big ocean of sentiment that struck me. So after I was done watching it, I thought, you're right. This is a big movie, one that I have heard of but hadn't seen before we decided on this podcast episode. And I'm glad that I now have it under my belt so I can feel emboldened to explore the whole rest of Bresson's filmography, which I know is also celebrated as significant every single title.
If you look at Pickpocket, if you look at The Fate of Balthazar, if you look at Diary of a Country Priest, and if you look at the film that we're considering, they are among the glories of 20th century cinema. And I think they're justly celebrated because of their precision, because of the way that they take their subject matter, which are about these profound themes that we're talking about the desire for freedom, about the hope for a better set of circumstances, and the willingness to sacrifice a lot and maybe everything in order to uphold your values. Paul Schrader is somewhat well known in film critical circles, not just for his amazing work as a director and writer, but also for his early, I think it was his dissertation in college, actually, that he then kind of dressed up and made into a really major book of film criticism. It's called The Transcendental Style in Film, Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer. When he talks about Bresson, when he talks about all of these filmmakers, he talks about slow filmmaking. Mm-hmm. This idea that there's a way to make a film that's got a lot of tension that doesn't have a car crash or a gunfight every few minutes, right? And A Man Escaped isn't slow in the sense it requires some patience to watch it, but it's in no way tedious, and because of that building anticipation about whether or not he will in fact escape, the film sustains it keeps its hold on your attention. That idea that in order to survive, you've got to make use of the bare essentials of whatever is around you. There's a sequence early on in the film, which you had mentioned, in which he takes a spoon, and Fontaine, our hero, takes a spoon, and as you described, he starts to disassemble the paneling in the door the heavy wooden door that leads to his cell. He spends, by his own account, hours on it, and he sort of obsesses over whether or not the spoon is too bent and whether the spoon, he's got enough leverage on the spoon, and he worries about the spoon breaking. And then once he starts to pry loose the panels, he has to get them back in so that the guards won't notice that he's disassembling the doorway to his cell. And I'm going to go really high into here. I'm going to invoke Heidegger's Origin of the Work of Art, where Heidegger talks about the importance in artistic works about the use value of objects. For instance, if you're using a hammer and then suddenly the hammer breaks because you're hammering too hard, you take a look at the handle and you see the grain of the wood, and you really see the actual reality of the handle for the first time. Heidegger references Van Gogh's painting of workman's boots, and how you really see those you experience not just the boots, but the entire interpretive context of those boots, right? The pain that the workers felt wearing them, how they must have been muddy. And that's what you get in that sequence in A Man Escaped, as he's using a spoon to dig through this heavy wood door. And also avoid being detected in doing this.
Right. It's a totally earned accomplishment when, in the very end of the movie, the music of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, which is the only music of the piece, accompanies him as he walks into town with this other inmate who's been recruited to his cause by necessity.
I believe they're both barefoot, right? That is Jost, his comrade, who he originally, the young man who joins him in prison, and who he originally believes is a informant, and then he makes this decision. It's so existential. He says to himself, well, either I'm going to have to take him with me or I'm going to have to kill him.
Yeah.
and he makes a moral decision. He is convinced, for whatever reason, that Jost really is a deserter. He's not a member of the resistance. There's nothing noble about Jost. He's a kid. And at the very end, Jost forgets to bring their jackets and shoes. So when they escape from prison, they're running barefoot.
What other elements of this movie make it great?
The ending is rather nihilistic. No matter how much you want to be free, your captivity might be permanent and irreversible, and the best that you can hope for is a noble death, desiring to be free.
You escape your prison to discover that you're actually captured in an even larger prison, to only escape that prison and discover an even larger prison, and so on forever.
Indeed. You don't know what becomes of Fontaine. In fact, I want to happily report to our listeners that André Deviné, the French resistance fighter upon whose memoir this story is actually based, it doesn't have any of the fantastical or silly qualities that a big dollhouse has. It's really based in actual experience. He lived to be 94. Survival, living on, is possible.
Bars on the windows and locked doors. Emotional prisoners settling old scores. Hard time doesn't heal old wounds. One flat and one sharp is in perfect tune. We could hold each other